Well, hey, we are back with another episode here on the HC Conversations podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Today we're going to be talking about the church, specifically some of the good things that the church has done, especially the benefits of being part of a church, because there's some pushback against the church in our society. Some people saying that, well, the church just needs to go away. It's antiquated. We don't need it in society. We should tax the churches. You know, why give them nonprofit status? Let's tax them because they make lots of money. And if we tax them, it just help them go away a lot faster. So
there's that thinking. This kind of has arisen out of some attitudes that we've seen, like in our own kind of lives and experience, and just kind of culturally, it's just everywhere. Of like, the church isn't really a necessary thing. Like, it's fine if you're a Christian, it's fine if you go to church and you do that, but it should be kind of it shouldn't be, in kind of public life, right? If you go to church, it's fine. Do a Sunday thing, right? Like, in fact, there actually are like some countries, and there have been times throughout history where it's like, oh yeah, you have free expression of religion, but you can't tell anybody about it. You can't like talk about it. But you can go to church on Sunday. And it's like, I think that's what a lot of people would like and say that would be a good thing for society, do your little church thing. But other than that, we don't need the church. Right.
And we, like Phil said, we've kind of experienced a little bit of that here in our own community where people are like, oh, that's really nice what you guys are doing. Glad you guys are doing that. But when it comes to being involved in anything that we're doing,
leave us alone.
We don't really want you to be part of it.
And then the whole taxing thing, that's just something that's like lives on the internet. And like, I'm just like, clearly you have an ignorance onto how like tax code even works, because it's like, well, tax the churches. It's like, well, what do you mean by that exactly? Because churches run on donations. So it's like, this is the way any 501c3 nonprofit works this way. It's like you get money and it's donation based, and so you're tax exempt because you're not in it to make a profit. So like churches don't make profit. In fact, if you've ever looked at the financials of most churches, it's like very, very streamlined. If like for healthy churches, we bring this much in, we pay our staff, and then we give lots of money away and do lots of aid and those kind of things. And so it's like, I mean, if you're going to go down that route of saying like we got to tax the churches, then either it's one, religious discrimination, or two, you're not to tax. You just got to get rid of the 501c3 status for any kind of organization.
Right, which leads to lots of problems because there's many non-religious organizations that fall under Section 501c3 of the tax code.
Yes.
Religious and non-religious, Christian and non-Christian. So that includes, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh. I don't know if there's any Sikh nonprofits out there, but I'm sure there is other religions.
And I think there's a misunderstanding too of like, okay, when it comes to that tax exempt status, like if you work for a church and you get paid by a church, you get taxed. So it's like, well, like we don't actually get paid to work here currently. Hopefully someday, right? But it's like, if the church pays me, there's going to be employment, like, Social Security, Medicare, like all that stuff's going to come out, right? So it's not that there's like churches don't have any kind of tax burden at all. Like they would still have the employer side of things to pay on that. It's just like, hey, maybe you don't have to pay sales tax on some things, and you don't have to pay property taxes. But other than that, it's like, it's not really any different than anywhere else. It's like, no, you don't have to pay income tax on people's donations, but they're donations, and they've already been taxed. They've already been income taxed because the people that made the money at their jobs got income taxed, and then they gave it to the church. So I'm just saying, if you think churches should be taxed, educate yourselves. Fight me. Do it. But a bigger thing, other than the logistics of that, and like the whole conversation around, well, tax churches, well, that would close a lot of churches.
Right.
And in fact, like that would close up like the majority of church, like specifically in like the United States context.
Right, because the majority of churches are small. They're under 200 people.
Yeah.
They're not these big, massive organizations like the media portrays churches as.
Right. Most of them, like the average church size, I think, is under 100, really. And it's like small budgets. Maybe you have one paid staff position, but like doubtful. Like a lot of these churches have part-time people, or people are bivocational, like we are, working multiple jobs. So it would close those churches. And some people say that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Again, we want to push them to the outside of society. We don't need the church. Religion was fine, but we're modern people. We're evolved. We have progressed beyond that. Why, Paul? Why? What?
We're not superstitious anymore. Just a little stitious.
We're just just a little stitious. What is that from?
The Office.
Yeah. So I was like, wait a minute. We're not superstitious. I'm just a little stitious. Like we don't need that anymore. Haven't we moved past that as a culture? So let's talk about that.
All right.
Like, what would be so bad about just saying we don't need church anymore?
Well, just from the spiritual aspect of it, I mean, as society gets darker, I mean, the light of Jesus and of the church gets to shine brighter. But then you take away, kind of the public face of that. So, you can never get rid of the church. Jesus promised that he would build his church and that nothing could stop it. But you get rid of the public vestiges of the church.
Ooh, vestiges, good word.
I mean, just imagine how, the spiritual forces of darkness would just get even stronger, and just imagine the impact that power of darkness could have on people's lives. And we already see the impact on people's lives, but just imagine if you get rid of the church, how much darker things could get.
Well, I would agree, and I would agree that works for if you're watching this and if you're a Christian, which most of you probably are because you're mostly people that go to our church. But say someone has stumbled upon this and said, well, I don't believe in that dark spiritual juju magumbo. Bad juju bees. Okay, juju bees is a candy. Y'all need to watch Psych, okay? If we accomplish anything in our pastoral careers, it will get people to watch Psych.
That's right.
But say, hey, I don't believe in that, right? And your definition of the culture getting darker, maybe I say that's just getting better. So someone who's skeptical of like, well, I don't believe in the spiritual aspect of things, which tangent though, like people actually are not less spiritual. They're actually, people are more spiritual than they used to be. They're just finding it a whole bunch of different places, from New Age spirituality and crystals and horoscopes and like, well, I like to meditate. It's like, we're still spiritual. We're just like, I want to create my own spirituality. That aside, what about just like the practical aspect? I'm not a Christian. I'm not a follower of Jesus. I'm not a religious person. Why do I care if the church goes away?
Why should you care? Because of, in addition to not just like, okay, so say you don't believe in, evil forces and darkness, but you believe in good. So logically, it makes sense that, well, you'd say, oh, well, I'm a good person because look at all the good that I have done, but I don't believe in evil. Well, that's not a logical end to say, well, there's good, but there's no evil. Well, if there's logically good, there logically has to be evil too. And you perhaps can think of some evil people. You can perhaps think of some world leaders that have done some evil things. But then, okay, along with that, okay, if you do good, then the church and Christians are also capable of doing good. And if we get rid of the church, then a lot of the good that the church has done, that goes away.
It goes away.
I mean, we didn't talk about this, but I just think of, the Salvation Army. They say doing the most good. The Red Kettle campaigns around the holidays. We're getting ready to see the kettles appear. But imagine for a second if the Salvation Army, because they're a Christian organization, if they suddenly disappeared, the amount of social assistance that they provide through
it's massive.
Rent, through addiction recovery, through the food that they give away, as well as there's so many other things that Salvation Army does. If just that organization went away, the impact that would have on our communities, because there's a presence of the Salvation Army in nearly every community.
Yeah, like around the world.
Yeah.
Like they're everywhere. And so that goes along too with like, okay, you think of something like the Salvation Army, but just like the church in general. And like the assistance in the programs and those kind of things. I don't have numbers on this. I'm just making things up. But especially in smaller communities or places where there's not as many resources available, but in larger ones too. If you would total up like the total amount of like, where does funding come for like benevolence, social programs, that kind of stuff, you will find that the combined efforts of Christians and churches and Christian organizations far outweighs anything else in society. And that's even true like in our American and Western context. But a lot of times as Americans, we get very myopic in our vision. We forget about the rest of the world. Right. And we're like, well, yeah, whether it's, it's a government program or a different nonprofit that just provides for the needs of people. Maybe you live in a community in America or in the West that has that. But for the majority of the world, I'm talking the worst places in the world as far as that have been war-torn, that experience poverty and hunger and like lack of clean water and all of these things, there are not programs. When you go into these communities in like the developing world where people are literally fighting for their lives every day, there is only one social assistance program hub, one place to get food, one place to get clean water, one place to get shelter, one place that is welcoming in women who've been rescued out of sex trafficking, and it is churches.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of Compassion International.
Oh, absolutely.
That we partner with. We sponsor our kids through Compassion, and Compassion, what they do is they provide funds to local churches in their community that they can run educational centers out of there, where they can provide well visits to families, where they can, whenever a mother has a baby, they can help provide the medical care needed for postpartum, for recovery, for prenatal stuff. And that's all done through churches. Through a church in that community. You said you didn't have a number, but I've got a number here.
Way to come to the rescue.
Christians in the United States donate $50 billion a year to churches and other nonprofits. So it's not just two churches; that's two churches and nonprofits. So $50 billion a year.
And that's like it's donated, right?
Right.
It's given, right? So that's like voluntarily saying, I am going to give, and we collectively as Christians are going to give $50 billion. That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
That's a whole lot, and that's just in the U.S., right? Yeah. So
and then you had some other statistics, I think, that talked about religious people versus non-religious in terms of how much they give.
And I want to get to those, but like something that you said just kind of sparked. You talked about what Compassion was doing. You said education. That just made me think. Like sometimes it's good to just slow down and recognize this and realize like the impact that Christians and followers of Jesus have made. And I know this isn't a current thing. We already have these things, but if we were to say, well, we don't need the church, then throughout history, like we don't have what are now known as modern orphanages, universities, hospitals. Like all of that came from followers of Jesus who said, hey, like we need to do this. Even like in our own country, like I think you and I are both listening through like a podcast right now about the history of fundamentalism and just kind of like the turn of the century, the 20th century. And it's like labor laws, the women's right to vote, like all these things that came of kind of arose at the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, and child labor laws and things like that. Those were all things that were driven by Christians and churches, where it's like, hey, because there's a vision of life that Jesus gives us that is modeled by love and sacrifice and giving of oneself for the betterment of someone else that drives the life of a Christian.
Right.
And so like that continues today, and especially, as we said, like in areas where that kind of aid's not available. So I just wanted to mention some of that stuff.
I mean, this kind of it ties in with what you just said, but gets us a little bit off track.
It's okay.
But the impact of Christianity on Western society, we wouldn't have Western society with all of its medical and scientific and educational advances without the church. Yeah. It was in 1000 AD that Oxford University was founded to train pastors, and they in addition to theological training, they taught them logic and reason and mathematics, and out of that grew the modern Western educational system, and the rights that we take for granted. Modern democracy came out of ideas born through Christianity at Oxford University.
Yeah. And that it's just interesting to say that too, because like there'll be pushback and say, no, we had these ideas and this stuff existed through the Greco-Roman culture, right? That's where it actually came from. There's a book that I would recommend by Tom Holland, not Tom Holland who plays Spider-Man, but there's a historian. He wrote a book called Dominion, and like he kind of went into it researching it, like kind of had like he's a study of like the classical world, and he had this idea. He was not a Christian. I think he might be now, but that like the Western society and like democracy and justice and these ideals that we have, that they came from kind of classical cultures, the Greco-Roman culture. But then as he researched it and discovered it, he's like, no, things that we have are not from that era. That like they did not have the value of dignity and justice and human worth and all these things that we have. It was the Christians that brought this. And so, yeah, it's just interesting.
And people make the argument, well, eventually we would have gotten there. But there's been no cultures, anthropologists have studied this, there's been no cultures that given enough time would have come up with these things without the influence of Jesus and Christianity and Christians around the globe.
And there's just a track record too of countries and cultures where the gospel goes, where like the church gets established and like there are Christians, that like human flourishing is increased. The status of women and children is increased. Like they have more freedoms. They have these things. Some of the things that are lobbed against Christianity of like the women thing specifically, you're bad for women. And it's like, yeah, people can take things out of context in the Bible and do some messed up things with it. But geographically and historically, every culture that Christianity has shown up in and made inroads, like life for women and children get better.
That's right. And tying into that and going back to something that we said earlier, that if we simply got rid of the church, Christianity, that, life would flourish. But history has not borne that out. In every society where there has been an attempt to get rid of Christianity, it's led to massive bloodshed. I've got some numbers here. Hitler killed 6 million of his own people. The Khmer Rouge killed 2 million people. Stalin killed 20 million of his own people. Mao killed about 50 to 70 million of his own people by getting rid of Christianity and establishing their own religion, a religion of statehood. And it's resulted in 100 million people being killed in the name of getting rid of, a religion.
That was
just within the last 100 years.
That was just the 20th century.
This Alistair McGrath, who is an Oxford scholar, has multiple PhDs in philosophy, mathematics. I forget what is. I think even theology.
I think so.
He's got like 3 or 4 PhDs. But he says this, that the 20th century gave gave rise to one of the greatest and most distressing paradoxes of human history. That the greatest intolerance and violence of that century were practiced by those who believe that religion causes intolerance and violence.
Yeah. And it's just interesting that we're in a similar place where there's a lot of people kind of, saying like, we don't need religion, we don't need church, we don't need these kind of things. So,
and then they think, well, we could do it better.
We could do better.
Well, history hasn't shown that anybody can do it better.
We have a long, bloody, violent, horrible history of humanity that says, no, we're not very good at doing this when we are left to our own devices. So we kind of got on a tangent there for a little bit because you had kind of set me up and said, hey, we got some numbers and some things. And so just random things that were kind of wrote down of like there is hard data to say that like actually church, Christians, like being a part of church and church in a society is actually good for society. And so let me just roll off some of these. That those who attend religious services regularly, and let me just say too, like these are polls that were done within an American context. And so by groups like Barna and Pew Research and
Gallup.
And so it's like legit, like there's a whole, there's a Harvard program of human flourishing that's got all kinds of information on this. And so that they ask kind of a general question of like, religious or religion. And so, yes, that will include samplings of some other religions in America, but predominantly this is majorly skewed towards Christianity and church, just simply because of our demographics. So here we go. Those who attend religious services regularly are 12% less likely to suffer from depression. They're 33% less likely to use illicit drugs, 30% less likely to start having sex at a young age, 40% less likely to have an STD, 18% more likely to report high levels of happiness, 87% more likely to have high levels of generosity, 38% more likely to volunteer in their community, and 47% more likely to have a sense of mission and purpose. So just like across the board, it's like, like more generosity, more giving, a couple other things along those lines, if I can read my own handwriting. So this is from the book American Grace by, it looks like Walter Putnam is the author, or where you would find some of these numbers, that for all people who volunteer for like a religious group or a church, so if you volunteer for like a church, 91% of those same people also volunteer for something in their community, something that's not faith-based. So 90% of people that volunteer in a faith-based thing volunteer in a non-faith-based thing. But on the flip side, 70% of people who don't volunteer in a church, they're like, yep, religion's not for me. They also don't volunteer anywhere else. And so like there's something about like the Jesus thing that says, I serve, but not just for people who are like me. I serve in places that are not like me. Churchgoers are 2% more likely to help the needy. They're 2% more likely to adopt. And so, like there's sometimes that criticism will be like, well, like Christians, you may be pro-life in terms of like politically, but you don't put your money where your mouth is. And certainly I think we need more Christians adopting, but compared to the general population, it's like something like 5% of practicing Christians adopt. Only 5% of Christians adopt. It's only like 2.5% of the general population. Of the most, they did like a sliding scale, the most kind of from the least religious to most religious in society, like kind of like, the 20% that are least, the 20% that are most, everyone in the middle. The most religious demographic are 4 times more generous than the least religious. regular churchgoers are more likely to give to secular causes than non-churchgoers. So Christians aren't just generous towards their church; they're generous towards other things as well. So if you're trying to raise funds, you got a kid going door to door, be like, hey, find the Christians and knock on their door. I mean, maybe it's kind of playing the system, but they're like statistically far more likely to say, sure, I'll give to that.
Right.
Sure, I'll be a part of that.
So before you continue on with some of your statistics,
Okay.
Unless you have more that tie in with that one.
No, that one's, that one.
Okay. So just anecdotally, like I've seen this in my other job, working with volunteers at Ohio State, that most of them also volunteer in their local church. I don't know how many volunteer applications I've read where it's like, I taught this at my church. I led this, at this organization. I was involved at this level of leadership in this religious organization, and just then getting involved in another aspect of giving back to their community through volunteering. And I would see that statistic playing out in that group of people too.
Yeah. All right, a couple more things.
Yep.
And these are less like number-wise and just kind of more results, some of the findings of these things. This came from that Harvard Human Flourishing Program in conjunction with the American Bible Society. A quote from who was the director of the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, Tyler Vandenweel, that said, "Scripture reading combined with other forms of community and discipleship, such as attending church, appears to contribute to people's sense of well-being and happiness." Jane Fortwith, again, I cannot read my own handwriting, from the University of North Carolina, has said religiosity seems to protect against depression. The effects seem especially strong for kids with severe depression, increasing religiosity by one standard deviation. So like you up your faith stuff by like one level. So I'm a person that doesn't go to church at all. I start going once a week. So increasing religiosity by one standard deviation decreases the probability of being at risk for moderate to severe depression by as much as 20%. Okay. Attendance at church weekly reduces mortality by 20 to 30% over a 15-year period. Like going to church reduces your risk of dying. Like that's just a crazy idea. Like these are insane. This is like insane statistics. And that's not to say, well, if you're not a Christian, you're not a follower of Jesus, that you're an awful human. You're not capable of doing good. No, I know lots of people that aren't Christians that do good things. But with when you come at an aspect of saying we don't need church, we don't need like faith, it does nothing good for society. You are ignoring mountains of like hard data and anecdotal data, and mountains of like historical data and global data that says, actually, the world would be a far worse place if it was not for the church.
Yeah. And I've seen articles encouraging people that even if you're not religious, going to religious services, attending church still has benefits for you, even if you don't believe what they believe yet. It just to try it. The Art of Manliness, I know that he's published several articles talking about that, linking back to other studies. And Brett McKay does a great job at him and his team doing research. So it's not just like, hey, we think you guys should go to church. It's like, no, even if you don't believe, here's what the research says the benefits are.
Yeah. Yeah, and just this is kind of off the topic, but I wanted to mention this too of it, the benefits of church, and understand again because this perspective comes from a American kind of like secularist. This is what the world is, but we lose sight of the global picture, and so. This is a quote from Rebecca McLaughlin, who says, Christianity, and this is backed by data, like Pew and Barna have done tons of data that actually show the shifting demographics. We think like Christianity is an American thing. It's not. Christianity is the largest and most diverse belief system in the world, representing the most even racial and cultural spread. So that's one of the things that sets Christianity apart. Most world religions are geographically like locked in. You have a little bit, but like mostly like where they started is where they stayed. Not so with Christianity. Roughly equal numbers of self-identifying Christians living in Europe, North America, Latin America, and sub-Saharan Africa. Over 60% of Christians live in the global South. And the center of gravity for Christianity in the coming decades will likely be increasingly non-Western. And it's actually on the rise. Like people think, like in our culture, hey, Christianity is dying. There's like 2.6 billion Christians worldwide right now. It's estimated by 2050 that there will be like 3.3 billion. in the location of where most of them will be living will be in Africa. And so here's the thing too, and I don't have this quote, I didn't write it down, but it was something along the lines of, and I'll get to the quote in a minute. Here's the thing, it's Christianity is increasingly non-Western. It's increasingly non-white. It's Latin Americans, or not just Americans, like people of Latino descent, African, Middle Eastern, like Chinese and Indian. It is a lot of people of color. And so there was a professor, I don't remember what school he was at, but said basically when, this is going to kind of sound insulting, but hey, it's what he said. Basically, whenever white progressive secularists criticize Christianity, it's like you're not actually criticizing who you think you are. You're primarily, in a worldwide perspective, criticizing people of color and minorities and people who are suffering and hurting. And so it's like, yeah, so just interesting. The church is good.
The church
It's
is
good.
is good.
It's
And so,
good.
I mean, you might have stumbled across this. You might be watching. You might be listening. You think, well, come on. You guys are pastors. You're both biased, obviously. And we are biased. But at the end of the day, it's not our bias. It's the mountains of research from religious, from non-religious, especially non-religious institutions that have shown the impact of Christianity on the world, on the culture, that if those things suddenly went away, that it would not be good for society.
For anyone, yeah. So, yeah.
But especially for the least of these, people that you care about, the widow, the orphan, people that need social assistance, that need food, things like that.
Yeah, and so you may not be a Christian, may not be a follower of Jesus, and that's okay. When we would love you to be, but and I get that there are some Christians that do wacky stuff and give a bad reputation, but most of us are out here trying to do good, and so give us the benefit of the doubt. And if you are a Christian, you are a follower of Jesus, this is how we're called to live, like to be those examples that make it undeniable in our communities that this is the Jesus way,
Right.
that we pattern our lives after a crucified king that says, it's not about what's going to be best for me, but how can I lay down my life for the service of others? And so that's what we're called to do.
It's not about conquering. It's, I have conquered sin and death. And so now, go and love your neighbor.
That's a good place to end it.
All right, well, thanks so much for tuning in, for listening. If you have any questions, you can email us at info@hopecommunityonline.org, or you can drop a comment if you're watching here on YouTube. And thanks so much. We'll see you back here next month with another episode.